Listen up, family. What I am about to break down for you right now is going to shatter every single thing you thought you knew about the biggest, longest, nastiest beef in modern hip-hop. Because 50 Cent just did something so surgical, so calculated, so devastatingly cold-blooded to Rick Ross that industry insiders are calling it the most brutal public execution in rap history. And I mean execution. This is not a diss track. This is not a subliminal shot. This is not a petty Instagram post. This is 50 Cent, the man they said was washed, the man they said was past his prime, the man Rick Ross has been trying to bury for nearly 2 decades, walking into the arena with receipts, numbers, screenshots, and a smirk that says the game is finally over. Rick Ross tried to end 50 Cent. Rick Ross went on every podcast. Rick Ross went on every microphone. Rick Ross went on every interview couch. And Rick Ross said things about 50 Cent that made the entire culture stop and stare. But what Rick Ross did not know, what Rick Ross could not have possibly seen coming, was that 50 Cent had been sitting quiet, watching, waiting, counting every single insult, and stacking them all up for the day the numbers dropped. And when the numbers dropped, family, when those first week sales landed like a piano falling out of a 5th floor window, 50 Cent did not laugh loud. 50 Cent laughed slow. And that slow laugh is the sound of a 20-year war ending in one afternoon. Here is the situation. Rick Ross just released his brand new album. It is called Set in Stone. Rick Ross had been hyping this project for months. Rick Ross was calling it his statement piece, his legacy record, the album that would remind the world exactly who the biggest boss of them all really is. Rick Ross went on live streams. Rick Ross went on radio. Rick Ross went on YouTube. And on every single one of those platforms, Rick Ross made sure to mention 50 Cent. Not once. Not twice. Every chance he got. Rick Ross said 50 Cent could not dress. Rick Ross said 50 Cent lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. Rick Ross said 50 Cent was broke. Rick Ross said 50 Cent had been sued into oblivion. Rick Ross said 50 Cent's own baby mama was a whole story he could tell if he wanted to. Rick Ross was cooking. Rick Ross was seasoning. Rick Ross was serving 50 Cent on a plate every single day of the album rollout. And the whole time, 50 Cent said nothing. Nothing. Not a word. Because 50 Cent, if you have watched this man operate for 25 years, you already know. 50 Cent does not talk when he is angry. 50 Cent talks when he is winning. And check this out. The album drops. Set in Stone hits the streaming platforms. Rick Ross is celebrating. Rick Ross is posting. Rick Ross is telling everybody to go stream. And then the numbers start coming in. And that is when the earth cracked open. Because the first week projections for Set in Stone were catastrophic. We are not talking about a soft opening. We are not talking about a slow start. We are talking about numbers so brutally low for a rapper of Rick Ross's caliber that the entire industry gasped. The album pulled in somewhere between 17,000 and 22,000 equivalent units in its first week. 17,000 units. For a man who used to move platinum. For a man who ran Maybach Music Group. For a man who sold out arenas across the world. 17,000 units. And 50 Cent, who had been sitting on that couch for months, who had been swallowing every insult like it was medicine, who had been letting Rick Ross dig his own 6-foot ditch, finally picked up his phone. And 50 Cent posted. Man, when 50 Cent posted, the internet stopped breathing. He said, quote, "If you have been in the game 15 or 20 years and you cannot sell 100,000 records, you are not a legend." Rick Ross saw it. Rick Ross felt it. Rick Ross knew exactly who that was aimed at. Because Rick Ross has been in the game 20 years. Rick Ross has 10+ studio albums. Rick Ross has more Grammy nominations than most of his peers. And Rick Ross just watched his brand new 12-track project barely crawl past the 17,000 line. 50 Cent did not have to say the name. Everybody knew. Every single fan, every single blogger, every single hip-hop podcast, every single person with a phone knew exactly which 250-pound target that shot was fired at. And that was only the beginning. Because after 50 Cent dropped that line, 50 Cent went nuclear. 50 Cent started posting screenshots. 50 Cent posted the streaming reports. 50 Cent posted what he claimed were the actual banking records from an old lawsuit he won against Rick Ross years ago. 50 Cent posted photos of what he alleged were empty seats at a Rick Ross concert in Detroit, and family, when I tell you those seats looked like a Sunday morning church service where only the deacon showed up, I am not exaggerating. 50 Cent captioned the photo with a laughing emoji and the words, "Sorry, it is over." That caption alone has been screenshotted hundreds of thousands of times. That caption is now a meme. That caption is now living rent-free in the head of every Rick Ross fan on the planet. And Rick Ross, being Rick Ross, could not let it slide. Rick Ross had to respond. Rick Ross always has to respond. And that is exactly where the trap was set. Because Rick Ross hopped on Instagram Live. Rick Ross put on his sunglasses. Rick Ross lit his cigar. And Rick Ross tried to explain the numbers. Rick Ross said the 17,000 was fine. Rick Ross said his first week was 22,000 and his second week was 20,000. Rick Ross said the reason the numbers looked low was because he refused to use bots. Rick Ross said the real flex in hip-hop today is not having inflated numbers. Rick Ross said other rappers, when their numbers drop off a cliff in week 2, that is a sign that week 1 was fake, and his numbers were pure. Rick Ross said this is the long game, baby. Rick Ross said this is how we hustle. Rick Ross said this is how we win. Rick Ross said we here 20 years later. Rick Ross said if he wanted to sell 250,000 the first week, he could have played that game. Rick Ross said the rappers 50 Cent has on G-Unit today cannot even show him a palm tree in their front yard. Rick Ross said his house is worth $45 million. Rick Ross even took a shot at Drake, calling Drake's chains grandma jewelry. Rick Ross was hot. Rick Ross was on fire. Rick Ross was saying every single thing he could to make it look like he was still winning. And then 50 Cent smiled. Because here is what Rick Ross did not realize. Every single thing Rick Ross just said on that live stream was ammunition. 50 Cent clipped every single line. 50 Cent screenshotted every single frame. 50 Cent turned the entire live stream into a highlight reel of humiliation. And 50 Cent started posting it, piece by piece, on his own Instagram. Every time Rick Ross tried to spin the numbers, 50 Cent posted the actual chart data. Every time Rick Ross said the streaming was inflated by bots on other albums, 50 Cent posted receipts of Rick Ross's own past first week sales during his peak. Every time Rick Ross said he was playing the long game, 50 Cent posted a picture of his G-Unit sneaker deal, his Starz television empire, his Diddy documentary, and his liquor company. And 50 Cent asked the internet a very simple question. If Rick Ross is winning the long game, why is 50 Cent the one with the empires and Rick Ross is the one selling 17,000 units? Family, this is where I have to stop and put this in perspective for you. Because a lot of people watching this do not understand exactly how brutal 17,000 first week units really is for someone at Rick Ross's level. Let me break it down. Rick Ross has been signed to major labels. Rick Ross has built one of the most powerful independent brands in hip-hop history. Rick Ross has been on features with Drake, with Jay-Z, with Meek Mill, with Whale, with every single major artist you can name. Rick Ross has a podcast with millions of downloads. Rick Ross has a wing empire. Rick Ross has real estate. Rick Ross has a car collection. Rick Ross has everything. And with all of that infrastructure, all of that co-signing power, all of that marketing budget behind him, Rick Ross could only pull 17,000 equivalent units in the biggest streaming era in music history. That is not a soft opening. That is a public collapse. And 50 Cent knew exactly what he was doing. Because 50 Cent did not just troll Rick Ross about the sales. 50 Cent used the sales as a mirror. And 50 Cent held that mirror up to Rick Ross's whole legacy. 50 Cent asked the culture a question that nobody wanted to answer out loud. If a rapper cannot sell 100,000 copies of an album in 20 years, are they really the biggest boss? If a rapper cannot fill an arena in a major American city, are they really running the culture? If a rapper has spent 2 decades cooking every $50,000 podcast interview with insults about the same enemy, is that rapper actually free, or is that rapper obsessed? These are the questions 50 Cent planted in the culture. And once those questions were planted, they could not be unplanted. Rick Ross could not undo them. Rick Ross could not deflect them. Rick Ross could only sit and watch as the internet went to work on his image. Now here is the part that hurts the most. Because even Drake of all people, came out of the shadows to add his 2 cents. Drake, who has been on the receiving end of Rick Ross's disses for over a year now ever since that whole Kendrick Lamar situation, Drake hopped on his own live stream and started subliminally talking about rappers who drop albums that come and go the same day. Drake said, and I am paraphrasing, that he appreciates the last few months because he dropped 3 albums on that head top, while these other guys are dropping albums that are hello and goodbye. Drake said be careful with that reply because the pen is not dry. Drake said do you realize what 100,000 copies actually is? Drake said we are like gambling with these rappers' record deals tonight. Drake said most of these guys did not even think anybody was getting that. Drake was laughing. Drake was reading. And Drake was aiming that entire monologue directly at Rick Ross. So now Rick Ross is not just being cooked by 50 Cent, Rick Ross is being cooked by Drake. Rick Ross is being cooked by the entire top tier of the hip-hop hierarchy. And Rick Ross has to sit and take it. Because the numbers are the numbers. And the numbers do not lie. Fam, what up? Before I go deeper into what 50 Cent did next, because trust me, 50 Cent has already fired 3 more shots since this whole thing started and each one is worse than the last, I need you to understand the full timeline of how this war got here. Because this is not a new beef. This is not a fresh feud. This is a 2-decade grudge match that has now finally reached the moment of decision. Rick Ross and 50 Cent have been at war since the mid-2000s. It started when 50 Cent, at the height of his own reign, decided to take a swing at Rick Ross's authenticity. 50 Cent flew Rick Ross's ex-girlfriend Tia around. 50 Cent posted videos with her. 50 Cent made Rick Ross look small in front of the entire industry. Rick Ross tried to fight back. Rick Ross dropped mafia music. Rick Ross dropped record after record. Rick Ross even sued 50 Cent over a sex tape that 50 Cent posted online involving Rick Ross's baby mama Lastonia. 50 Cent won that case, cleared it out in court, and moved on. Rick Ross carried the loss silently for years. And that quiet defeat has been the fuel behind every single Rick Ross diss ever since. Because think about this. Every single time Rick Ross has been in trouble over the past decade, Rick Ross has pulled the 50 Cent card. When Rick Ross's health scares hit the news, Rick Ross mentioned 50 Cent. When Rick Ross's record sales started slipping, Rick Ross mentioned 50 Cent. When Rick Ross got into it with Drake and got publicly embarrassed on that Canada trip, Rick Ross came home and mentioned 50 Cent. There is a pattern here. And 50 Cent finally called it out. 50 Cent said on a recent interview, quote, when things get bad for him, he mentions me. It gets covered first. Nothing else works for him outside of mentioning me. And when you look at the evidence, family, you cannot argue with what 50 Cent is saying. Because it is true. Rick Ross has built an entire media strategy around orbiting 50 Cent. And 50 Cent has finally decided to burn the entire orbit down. Now here is where it gets crazier. Because Rick Ross, after seeing those numbers, tried to change the narrative. Rick Ross went back on live and started attacking 50 Cent's G-Unit artists. Rick Ross said Lloyd Banks does not have his own sneaker. Rick Ross said the other G-Unit rappers do not have their own shoes. Rick Ross said 50 Cent should focus on the sneaker business because the reality show he was working on is not happening anymore. Rick Ross was reaching. Rick Ross was grasping. Rick Ross was doing everything he could to shift the conversation away from Set in Stone sales. And 50 Cent, being the sniper that he is, let Rick Ross exhaust himself completely. Because 50 Cent knows that when your opponent is drowning, you do not throw them a rope. You throw them an anvil. And 50 Cent had an anvil waiting. The anvil was a post 50 Cent had been holding for weeks. It was a compilation. A supercut. Every single interview Rick Ross had done over the past year where he insulted 50 Cent. All of it. Edited together. Set to music. Uploaded to Instagram. And captioned with one line. That line was, quote, this is what obsession looks like. And when I tell you that post broke the culture, I am not being dramatic. That post got shared millions of times. That post trended on Twitter for 3 straight days. That post was the moment Rick Ross's own supporters started quietly stepping back and admitting, okay, maybe Rick Ross has been a little too focused on this one man for a little too long. Because when you see 2 years of interviews cut together, and every single one of them contains a 50 Cent mention, it stops looking like beef. It starts looking like a hostage situation. And the hostage is Rick Ross's own peace of mind. Now let me hit you with the most cold-blooded twist in this entire saga. Because 50 Cent did not just win the numbers war. 50 Cent did not just win the internet war. 50 Cent won the business war too. And here is how. While Rick Ross was on podcasts talking about 50 Cent's apartment, 50 Cent was closing a deal with Starz to extend his Power universe for another 5 years. While Rick Ross was posting pictures of his mansion, 50 Cent was signing a distribution deal for his Branson cognac line that reportedly puts his liquor company on the same shelf as Diageo's biggest brands. While Rick Ross was recording Set in Stone, 50 Cent was executive producing a documentary on Sean Combs that reached tens of millions of viewers globally and reshaped how the world talks about Diddy forever. Rick Ross was fighting for streaming units. 50 Cent was fighting for the culture itself. And when the dust settled, it became painfully clear which one of these two men had actually built a legacy that transcends music. And this is the part that Rick Ross fans do not want to hear. Because look, Rick Ross is a genuinely gifted rapper. Rick Ross has legendary albums. Rick Ross gave us Trilla. Rick Ross gave us Teflon Don. Rick Ross gave us God Forgives, I Don't. Rick Ross gave us Port of Miami. Rick Ross gave us bar after bar of luxurious, cinematic, mafioso rap that shaped an entire generation of imitators. Nobody is taking that away from Rick Ross. But hip-hop is not just about lyrics anymore. Hip-hop is about ecosystems. Hip-hop is about empires. Hip-hop is about diversification. And 50 Cent understood that shift 10 years before Rick Ross did. 50 Cent stopped chasing chart positions in 2014. 50 Cent started building businesses. 50 Cent built power. 50 Cent built G-Unit Books. 50 Cent built Sire Spirits. 50 Cent built a television empire that has produced more black-led drama than any other network in America. Rick Ross was still chasing plaques while 50 Cent was buying entire industries. And now, 12 years later, the receipts have arrived. Man, let me tell you something. This whole situation has cracked open a much deeper conversation about legacy in hip-hop. Because for a long time, the culture measured success by album sales, by feature verses, by radio spins. That was the metric. That was the scoreboard. But 50 Cent, with this Rick Ross moment, has forced the entire culture to update the scoreboard. Because now the question is not just how many units did you move last week. The question is, what do you own? What do you build? What do you leave behind? And by that metric, 50 Cent is not just winning this beef. 50 Cent is winning the entire era. 50 Cent has redefined what a rapper can become in the 21st century. And Rick Ross, for all his greatness, is being used as the cautionary example. Fam, drop your take in the comments right now. Because I want to know how you feel about this. Is 50 Cent being petty by clowning Rick Ross's numbers? Or is 50 Cent finally cashing in on 20 years of Rick Ross disrespect? Is Rick Ross a legend regardless of the numbers? Or does the modern era demand more than just past classics? And most importantly, do you think Rick Ross has any move left, any comeback, any counterpunch that can actually turn this narrative around? Because from where I am sitting, this looks like game, set, and match. But hip-hop is a wild sport, and stranger comebacks have happened. Now let me get into what happened next, because this is where 50 Cent went from cold-blooded to surgical. 50 Cent, seeing that the culture was fully on his side, decided to do something Rick Ross could not defend. 50 Cent went back into his archive. 50 Cent pulled out an old interview from over a decade ago where Rick Ross was on camera predicting the future of his own career. In that interview, Rick Ross was asked what his numbers would look like 10 years down the line. Rick Ross laughed. Rick Ross said he would still be dropping platinum. Rick Ross said he would still be filling arenas. Rick Ross said he would still be the biggest boss of them all. And 50 Cent posted that clip. And right next to that clip, 50 Cent posted the 17,000 first week screenshot from Set in Stone. Side by side. No caption needed. The image told the whole story. Past Rick Ross promising platinum. Present Rick Ross barely cracking 20,000. And that post, family, that post was the final nail in the coffin. Because now every single hip-hop blog, every single podcast, every single reaction channel had to cover it. The story was too big. The visual was too damning. The narrative was too clean. Rick Ross could not respond because there was nothing to respond to. It was his own words. It was his own numbers. It was his own reality. And 50 Cent just held up the mirror and let it do the work. That is the level 50 Cent operates on. That is the surgical precision that makes 50 Cent one of the most dangerous men to ever hold a grudge in this industry. Rick Ross was not just out-rapped. Rick Ross was out-strategized. Rick Ross was out-marketed. Rick Ross was outmaneuvered. And Rick Ross has to live with those receipts forever. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Because after all of this happened, sources close to Rick Ross's camp started leaking to the press that Rick Ross was, quote, over it, and ready to move on. Rick Ross was reportedly telling his team that he did not want to talk about 50 Cent anymore. Rick Ross was reportedly telling his podcast partners that the 50 Cent bit was played out. Rick Ross was reportedly trying to pivot his entire brand toward wellness, real estate, and philanthropy. Rick Ross was, in other words, waving the white flag without actually waving it. And 50 Cent, who reads the internet like a general reads a battlefield, saw the retreat and pounced one more time. 50 Cent posted a laughing emoji. Just a laughing emoji. No words. Because when your opponent is retreating, the only thing left to do is laugh them out of the building. And that laughing emoji, family, that laughing emoji has been screenshotted, memed, tattooed, and printed on t-shirts by fans across the country. It is the sound of a war ending. It is the sound of a 20-year grudge finally reaching its verdict. Now let me tell you what nobody in the mainstream media is saying. Because there is a deeper layer to this whole story that only the real hip-hop heads are picking up on. 50 Cent, this entire time, was not just fighting Rick Ross. 50 Cent was fighting an entire archetype. 50 Cent was fighting the archetype of the rapper who peaks in his 20s and then spends his 40s and 50s trying to recreate that peak. 50 Cent was proving that there is a smarter path. 50 Cent was proving that hip-hop artists can age with grace, with intelligence, with business acumen, and with the ability to laugh at the ones who cannot. 50 Cent was drawing a blueprint. And every single young artist watching this beef unfold has been taking notes. Because the lesson is loud. The lesson is clear. The lesson is this. Do not chase the charts. Build the empire. Do not chase the diss. Build the receipts. Do not chase the feud. Build the future. That is what 50 Cent has been teaching the culture for a decade, and this Rick Ross moment is the graduation ceremony. And here is a wild wrinkle that only broke in the last 48 hours. Because it turns out, according to multiple industry sources, that Rick Ross's own label was quietly frustrated with the set-in-stone rollout long before the numbers dropped. Insiders are saying that the marketing team pushed Rick Ross to focus on the music, focus on the singles, focus on the visuals. But Rick Ross reportedly insisted on making the 50 Cent angle central to the promotion. Rick Ross reportedly believed that reigniting the beef would drive attention to the album. Rick Ross reportedly told his team that any press was good press. And the label, out of respect, went along with it. But privately, some of those executives are now saying that Rick Ross's obsession with 50 Cent may have actually cost the album real streaming numbers. Because instead of talking about the songs, Rick Ross was talking about 50 Cent. Instead of promoting the features, Rick Ross was insulting a rival. Instead of building anticipation for the music, Rick Ross was building anticipation for a response that never came. And when 50 Cent stayed silent, the promotional engine had nothing to run on. Set in stone, in the end, may have been sabotaged not by 50 Cent, but by Rick Ross's fixation on 50 Cent. Man, that is a level of self-inflicted damage that hip-hop has rarely seen. Because usually, when a rapper is beefing, the beef sells the album. Usually, when a rapper is throwing shots, the shots become the marketing. Usually, when a rapper is trolling, the trolling drives streams. But this time, the beef starved the album. This time, the shots landed on empty air. This time, the trolling turned into a boomerang that came back and hit Rick Ross in the wallet. And that boomerang, family, that boomerang was thrown by nobody but Rick Ross himself. 50 Cent did not have to do a thing. 50 Cent just had to wait. And 50 Cent, if there is one thing you know about that man, 50 Cent is the greatest waiter in hip-hop history. Now let me pivot to something that has been getting overlooked in all of this coverage. Because a lot of the reaction videos are focused on 50 Cent's clown session and Rick Ross's cope response. But nobody is really talking about what this means for the future of the beef. And I want to tell you what I think is going to happen next. Because these two men are not going to stop. That is the first thing you need to understand. Rick Ross and 50 Cent are not going to bury this beef. They are going to carry this beef into their 60s. They are going to carry this beef into their 70s. They are going to carry this beef into whatever retirement home eventually houses them both. Because this is not a beef about music anymore. This is a beef about identity. This is a beef about legacy. This is a beef about who gets to be remembered as the smarter one when the culture writes the final chapter. And neither one of these men is willing to concede a single inch. But here is what is going to change. The next round is not going to be about diss tracks. The next round is going to be about business moves. Because 50 Cent, having established total dominance in the numbers war, is going to expand into industries that Rick Ross has claimed as his own. Watch. 50 Cent is going to launch a wing chain that competes with Wingstop. 50 Cent is going to launch a spirit that competes with Bel Air. 50 Cent is going to launch a podcast that competes with Rick Ross's podcast. 50 Cent is going to move into Rick Ross's lanes one at a time. And every single time 50 Cent moves into a lane, 50 Cent is going to post a comparison chart. That is 50 Cent's method. That is 50 Cent's blueprint. Attack the ego. Attack the empire. Never let up. And Rick Ross, if history is any guide, is going to keep responding. Because Rick Ross cannot help it. Rick Ross has to say something. Rick Ross cannot let a shot go unanswered. And every response is going to give 50 Cent more material to work with. It is a perfect feedback loop of humiliation. And it is going to run for years. Fam, hold the line for a second, because I want to zoom out and give you the historical context that makes this whole moment even more insane. Because when hip-hop historians look back on this era 10 and 20 years from now, they are going to point to this exact week as a turning point. This is the week that hip-hop finally stopped worshipping first-week sales. This is the week that hip-hop finally started measuring artists by what they own, not what they charted. This is the week that hip-hop finally admitted that a rapper who cannot sell 100,000 copies in 20 years is not automatically a legend just because he had a hot run in his 20s. And 50 Cent, for better or worse, is the man who forced that conversation. 50 Cent is the man who dropped the hammer on the illusion. 50 Cent is the man who said, out loud, what everybody was thinking but nobody wanted to say. And that takes a level of courage that even 50 Cent's enemies have to respect. Now, let me be fair, because I want to give both sides their flowers. Rick Ross has done more for the culture than most rappers of his generation. Rick Ross has signed young talent. Rick Ross has invested in black-owned businesses. Rick Ross has been a voice for the South when the South needed a voice. Rick Ross has built a mansion that literally hosts community events. Rick Ross has cooked wings that fed neighborhoods. Rick Ross is not a villain. Rick Ross is a complicated figure. And Rick Ross is a man who, when the dust settles on his career, will be remembered as one of the most important lifestyle rappers of the 21st century. But that does not change the fact that Rick Ross picked the wrong fight. Rick Ross picked a fight with a man who never sleeps. Rick Ross picked a fight with a man who plays chess when everyone else is playing checkers. Rick Ross picked a fight with 50 Cent. And nobody, in the 25-year history of hip-hop, has ever won a fight against 50 Cent. Not Ja Rule. Not Fat Joe. Not Cameron. Not The Game. Not Diddy. Not Rick Ross. Nobody. And that is not opinion. That is public record. Because let me remind you of the graveyard 50 Cent has built over the years. Ja Rule was on top of the world when 50 Cent started aiming at him. Ja Rule had the pop hits. Ja Rule had the Ashanti collaborations. Ja Rule had the movie career. And 50 Cent dismantled all of it in 18 months. Fat Joe was a New York legend when 50 Cent aimed at him. Fat Joe had the Terror Squad. Fat Joe had Lean Back. And 50 Cent forced Fat Joe into a decade of career recalibration. Cameron had the Dipset movement peaking when 50 Cent aimed at him. And Dipset never recovered its original peak position. This is the pattern. 50 Cent identifies a target. 50 Cent waits for the target to make a mistake. And 50 Cent then executes with a level of precision that is genuinely terrifying. Rick Ross knew this pattern. Rick Ross had watched it happen to others. And Rick Ross still walked into the arena. That is the tragedy of this whole story. Rick Ross was warned by history itself, and Rick Ross ignored the warning. Man, let me get into one more layer of this, because I think it is the most fascinating layer of all. And that is the layer of psychology. Because 50 Cent, at his core, is a psychological warrior. 50 Cent understands human emotion better than most therapists. 50 Cent understands what triggers a man. 50 Cent understands what humiliates a man. 50 Cent understands what makes a man double down instead of walk away. And 50 Cent uses that knowledge like a scalpel. When 50 Cent targeted Rick Ross's album sales, 50 Cent was not just attacking a number. 50 Cent was attacking Rick Ross's entire self-image. Because Rick Ross's brand, from day one, has been about being the biggest boss. Everything Rick Ross wears, everything Rick Ross drives, everything Rick Ross raps about, is built to project the image of a man who has already won. And when 50 Cent posted numbers that undermined that image, 50 Cent was not just clowning. 50 Cent was systematically dismantling the myth. That is why the shots hurt so much. That is why Rick Ross could not just laugh him off. That is why Rick Ross had to respond, again and again, even as every response made him look smaller. Because 50 Cent was not attacking Rick Ross's music. 50 Cent was attacking Rick Ross's identity. And identity, once cracked, is very hard to repair. And here is the part that I really need you to hear. Because this applies to more than just hip-hop. This applies to life. Never pick a fight with a patient enemy. Never underestimate a person who is willing to sit quiet and wait. Never assume that silence means defeat. Because sometimes silence is just the pause before the punch. 50 Cent was quiet for months while Rick Ross ran his mouth. 50 Cent was quiet while Rick Ross cooked. 50 Cent was quiet while the podcast stacked up. But 50 Cent was not absent. 50 Cent was collecting. 50 Cent was watching. 50 Cent was building the dossier. And when the moment came, 50 Cent did not fire once. 50 Cent fired a full clip. And every single bullet hit the target. That is the lesson. That is the takeaway. That is the reason this story is going to be studied in hip-hop history classes decades from now. So where does this leave Rick Ross? Where does this leave 50 Cent? Where does this leave the culture? Rick Ross is going to keep going. Rick Ross is going to drop more albums. Rick Ross is going to keep the podcast running. Rick Ross is going to keep saying the biggest boss thing on every appearance. But something has changed. The armor has cracked. The invincibility has evaporated. And every future move Rick Ross makes is going to be measured against the shadow of set in stone. That is the mark 50 Cent has left. That is the stain that will not wash out. 50 Cent, on the other hand, is going to keep laughing. 50 Cent is going to keep posting. 50 Cent is going to keep building. And 50 Cent is going to keep reminding the culture, again and again, that patience beats panic every single time. Now I want to leave you with one final thought. Because this whole beef, in the end, is not really about 50 Cent versus Rick Ross. It is about two philosophies of life colliding. Rick Ross represents the philosophy of loud living. Live loud. Rap loud. Spend loud. Beef loud. Be seen. Be heard. Never quiet. Never still. 50 Cent represents the philosophy of strategic living. Move quiet. Build quiet. Wait quiet. And when you strike, strike so hard that the noise takes care of itself. Both philosophies have their appeal. Both philosophies have produced legends. But in the year 2026, in the current era of hip-hop, in the current era of attention economics, one philosophy is winning and one is losing. And you are watching the results play out in real time. Drop your take in the comments. Who won this round? Was it 50 Cent with the receipts? Was it Rick Ross with the resilience? Is this beef finally over? Or is Rick Ross about to drop a diss track that flips the entire narrative on its head? And more importantly, if you are a young artist watching this, which philosophy are you going to follow? The loud living blueprint? Or the strategic waiting blueprint? Because the choice you make right now is going to define the next 20 years of your career. And before you close this video, I need to plant one more seed in your head. Because there is a question the hip-hop world has been afraid to ask, and I am going to ask it right now. What happens if 50 Cent, having buried Rick Ross so cleanly, decides to write about the entire experience in a book? What happens if 50 Cent turns this set-in-stone moment into the opening chapter of a memoir on strategic patience? What happens if 50 Cent takes the receipts he has been quietly gathering and turns them into a documentary series that plays on his own Starz network? Because if you know 50 Cent, you already know the answer. 50 Cent never wastes ammunition. 50 Cent never lets a victory sit unmonetized. 50 Cent will find a way to squeeze more mileage out of this Rick Ross moment for the next 5 years, easy. That is what makes 50 Cent so terrifying. The war never actually ends. The war just moves into new mediums, new platforms, new revenue streams. And Rick Ross, meanwhile, has to wake up every single morning knowing that his humiliation is now a permanent part of the 50 Cent business empire. So let me hear it in the comments. End of story, no debate. Family, until the next one, keep your eyes open, keep your notifications on, and remember, in hip-hop, the loudest man in the room is almost never the one holding the checkbook. The checkbook always belongs to the man who was smart enough to stay quiet until it was time to speak. And 50 Cent, right now, is the man holding the checkbook. Rick Ross has the pen. 50 Cent has the paper. And when the accountant closes the books on this generation of hip-hop, 50 Cent will be the name written in gold and Rick Ross will be the name written in the margin. Peace.